The galaxy burns, not with the controlled fires of Palpatine's plan, but with something far worse. Imagine it, thousands of crimson lightsabers igniting across Coruscant. Dark side warriors, each one radiating hatred through the Force like a scream. The Jedi Temple surrounded, not by loyal clone troopers executing an order they don't understand, but by an army of Sith. An army that knows exactly what they're doing. An army that's been waiting for this moment. This is what happens when Sidious abandons subtlety, when he decides that raw power matters more than patience. When he looks at his master plan and thinks, why hide in the shadows when I could unleash darkness itself? One choice, one different path, and everything changes. The Clone Wars as we know them? Gone. Replaced by something that makes Order 66 look merciful. The careful political maneuvering, impossible when your army radiates evil that every Force sensitive in the galaxy can feel. The grand deception that nearly destroyed the Jedi. Shattered the moment the first Sith warrior stepped onto a battlefield wearing Republic colors. But here's what makes this terrifying. Palpatine actually considered it. The ancient Sith holocrons whispered to him about armies of dark side users that once conquered entire sectors. The power was there for the taking. All he needed was the ambition to reach for it and the ruthlessness to forge thousands of Force-sensitive beings into weapons of pure destruction. So, what stopped him? Why did the Master Manipulator, the most powerful Sith Lord in 1,000 years, choose clone troopers instead? And more importantly, what would have happened if he hadn't? The answer reveals why Palpatine's canonical plan was genius, and why this alternate path would have been his greatest mistake. Because sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the one that screams its presence. It's the one your enemy never sees coming until the blade is already at their throat. To understand how catastrophically wrong this could have gone, we need to appreciate what Palpatine actually achieved with his clone army. The clone army wasn't just a military force. It was a masterpiece of deception, a weapon hidden in plain sight. When the Kaminoans presented their product to the Jedi, they saw exactly what Sidious wanted them to see. Loyal soldiers, bred for combat, designed to serve the Republic without question. The clones were perfect because they were unremarkable in the Force. They had no dark side taint, no sinister presence that would alert the Jedi to the trap being laid before them. They were, in every measurable way, exactly what the Republic needed in its hour of crisis. More than that, the clones were acceptable. The Jedi Council, despite their reservations, could rationalize leading an army of living beings into battle because these soldiers had been created for this purpose. There was a moral ambiguity there, certainly, but nothing that screamed of Sith manipulation. The clones integrated seamlessly into Republic society. They fought alongside Jedi generals, earned the respect of senators, and became symbols of Republic resilience. They were the perfect cover for the greatest betrayal in galactic history. The inhibitor chips implanted in every clone were Sidious's insurance policy. Order 66 wasn't just a command, it was a guarantee. When the time came, there would be no hesitation, no moral crisis, no possibility of refusal. The clones would turn on their Jedi generals not out of hatred or ambition, but because they had been programmed to do so at a biological level. It was cold, efficient, and utterly ruthless. This was the work of a master manipulator who understood that the best weapons are those your enemy never sees coming. But what if Sidious had chosen a different path? What if, drunk on the power of the dark side and the ancient knowledge he had accumulated over decades of study, he had decided that subtlety was weakness? What if he had looked at the Sith of old, the armies of dark side warriors that had once threatened to consume the galaxy, and thought, why not rebuild that glory? Let's imagine the divergence point. Perhaps it happens after Sidious discovers a holocron on Korriban, an ancient Sith teaching device that reveals techniques for mass indoctrination and rapid dark side training. Or maybe it occurs after he witnesses the Battle of Geonosis and decides that the clone army, while effective, lacks the raw destructive potential he craves. Whatever the catalyst, Sidious makes a choice that will alter the course of history. Instead of ordering more clones from Kamino, he begins a secret program to identify, capture, and corrupt Force-sensitive beings from across the galaxy. The logistics. of creating a Sith army would be monumentally complex. The Jedi Order numbered around 10,000 at the height of its power, and they had been recruiting for millennia. To build an army of even a fraction of that size in the span of a few years would require resources that even Sidious, with all his wealth and influence, would struggle to marshal. But let's assume he finds a way. Perhaps he uses the Separatist crisis as cover, sending agents to war-torn worlds where Force-sensitive children have been orphaned or abandoned. Perhaps he establishes hidden academies on remote planets, places where the dark side runs strong and the screams of the tortured cannot be heard. The training regimen would be brutal beyond comprehension. Traditional Sith teachings emphasized the rule of two, one master, one apprentice. This wasn't just tradition, it was a survival mechanism designed to prevent the Sith from destroying themselves through infighting. But Sidious would be attempting to train thousands simultaneously. He couldn't afford to spend decades molding each student individually. Instead, he would need to accelerate the process through Sith alchemy, through pain, through breaking his students down and rebuilding them as weapons. Imagine facilities that make the Jedi Temple look like a sanctuary by comparison. Candidates would be subjected to constant physical and psychological torture designed to fuel their connection to the dark side. Those who broke would be discarded. Those who survived would emerge as something barely recognizable as the children they once were. They would be taught to channel their rage, their hatred, their fear into power. Lightsaber combat, force lightning, mental domination. Every technique would be learned through suffering, every lesson reinforced with pain. But here's where Sidious's plan begins to fracture. The dark side is not a tool that can be wielded casually. It corrupts, it consumes, it transforms those who touch it. Every one of these Sith warriors would be ambitious, hungry for power, convinced of their own superiority. The rule of two existed for a reason. Without it, how could Sidious maintain control? He would need to establish himself not just as a leader, but as a god, an unchallengeable force that could crush any dissent instantly. He would need to rule, through fear so absolute that even the most ambitious Sith would never dare challenge him. Even if he succeeded in creating this army, the question of scale remains. The clone army numbered in the millions by the war's end. Sidious's Sith army would be lucky to reach tens of thousands, and that's being generous. The galaxy simply doesn't produce Force-sensitive beings at a rate that would allow for a military force comparable to the Grand Army of the Republic. So we're not talking about replacing the clones entirely. We're talking about an elite force, a dark side equivalent of the Jedi Order, but twisted and corrupted beyond recognition. Now let's imagine how the Clone Wars would unfold in this timeline. The moment Sidious deploys his Sith warriors, everything changes. These aren't subtle operatives working in the shadows. These are walking manifestations of the dark side, each one radiating malevolence through the Force like a beacon. The Jedi would sense them immediately. There would be no gradual realization, no slow awakening to the trap. From the very first battle, the Jedi would know that something was catastrophically wrong. Picture the first engagement. Republic forces, led by Jedi generals, arrive to counter a separatist attack. But instead of battle droids, they face ranks of dark-robed figures igniting crimson lightsabers. The Jedi would be stunned. For 1,000 years, the Sith had been extinct. Now, suddenly, there are hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, fighting under the banner of the Republic. The cognitive dissonance alone would be paralyzing. How could this be possible? Who trained them? And most importantly, who is controlling them? The battles themselves would be nightmarish. Sith warriors wouldn't fight with the discipline of clones or the cold efficiency of droids. They would fight with savage fury, with cruelty, with a desire not just to defeat the enemy, but to make them suffer. Civilian casualties would skyrocket. Prisoners would be tortured for information or simply for sport. Every world touched by this war would be left traumatized in ways that the original Clone Wars never achieved. But the Sith army would also be terrifyingly effective in certain ways. Individual Sith warriors would be worth dozens of conventional soldiers. Their ability to use the Force would make them nearly unstoppable against non-Force-sensitive opponents. They could deflect blaster fire, crush enemies with telekinesis, and sense ambushes before they happened. In small-scale engagements, they would be devastating. However, they would also be vulnerable in ways that clones never were. The dark side makes its users arrogant, reckless, prone to infighting. A squad of Sith warriors wouldn't function as a cohesive unit the way clone troopers did. They would compete for glory, for kills, for the favor of their masters. This internal competition would make them unpredictable. The public reaction would be immediate and catastrophic for Sidious's plans. In the original timeline, the clone army was controversial, but ultimately acceptable to most Republic citizens. They were seen as a necessary evil in desperate times. But a Sith army? The average citizen of the Republic has grown up on stories of the Sith as ancient villains, as the ultimate embodiment of evil. To see them fighting under Republic colors would be incomprehensible. It would shatter trust in the government overnight. Senators would demand answers. How did the Republic acquire a Sith army? Who authorized their training? Where did they come from? Palpatine, as Supreme Chancellor, would be forced to provide explanations, and this is where his plan truly begins to collapse. He built his power on the illusion of being a benevolent leader, a grandfather figure guiding the Republic through crisis. That illusion cannot survive the revelation that he commands an army of dark side users. And then there's the Jedi response. In the original timeline, the Jedi were hampered by their attachment to the Republic, by their role as generals, by the gradual erosion of their ability to see clearly through the Force. But an army of Sith would cut through all that fog instantly. The Jedi Council would know without question that a Sith Lord was behind this, and their investigation would lead them directly to Palpatine far sooner than it did in the canonical timeline. Imagine Mace Windu, Yoda, and the other council members confronting Palpatine not at the end of the war, but near its beginning. They wouldn't have proof yet, not the kind that would satisfy the Senate, but they would have suspicions. And unlike their canonical counterparts, they wouldn't wait. The presence of thousands of Sith warriors would radicalize even the most cautious Jedi. They would see this as an existential threat that demanded immediate action. The confrontation could happen years earlier than Order 66. Perhaps Yoda and Mace lead a strike team to the Chancellor's office, intent on arresting him or, if necessary, eliminating him before he can complete whatever dark plan he's orchestrating. This fight would be legendary. Palpatine, caught before he's ready to fully reveal himself, would be forced to defend his position. He's powerful, perhaps the most powerful Sith Lord who has ever lived. But against multiple Jedi Masters, the outcome is far from certain. Let's explore different possible outcomes from this scenario. In the first possibility, the Jedi succeed. They kill or capture Palpatine before he can consolidate power. Without their leader, the Sith army fragments. Some warriors might try to seize control, leading to a chaotic free-for-all as dark side users battle each other for dominance. Others might flee into hiding, becoming a persistent threat that the Jedi will spend decades hunting down. The Republic survives, but it's been deeply wounded by the revelation that its own Chancellor was a Sith Lord. Trust in institutions crumbles, and the galaxy enters a period of reformation and recovery. But this outcome assumes the Jedi act decisively and successfully, which is far from guaranteed. Palpatine didn't become the Emperor through poor planning. He's a master of manipulation, and even caught off guard, he's extraordinarily dangerous. So let's consider the second possibility. Palpatine survives the Jedi's assassination attempt and uses it to his advantage. He declares the Jedi traitors, claims they attempted a coup, and uses his Sith army to hunt them down openly rather than through the subterfuge of Order 66. This scenario leads to a more brutal, more obvious purge of the Jedi. Instead of being betrayed by their clone commanders, the Jedi find themselves hunted by dark side warriors across the galaxy. Some Jedi would escape, more than did in the canonical timeline, because the Sith army lacks the clone army's ubiquity. You can't station Sith warriors in every corner of the galaxy the way you could with clones, but those Jedi who are caught would face fates far worse than a quick death. The Sith would relish the opportunity to torture and break Jedi, to corrupt them or to make examples of them. The empire that emerges from this scenario would be darker, more overtly evil than the one we know. Palpatine wouldn't be able to maintain the facade of the benevolent emperor. His regime would be built on naked force, on terror, on the visible presence of Sith warriors enforcing his will. This would make rebellion more likely, more immediate. Systems would resist openly rather than being slowly ground down. The empire would be powerful but unstable, constantly battling insurgencies, constantly struggling to maintain control through force rather than through the bureaucratic machinery that made the canonical empire so effective. The third possibility is perhaps the most interesting. Total chaos. What if Palpatine's attempt to control an army of Sith backfires completely? The dark side is inherently self-destructive. Every Sith warrior would crave power, would see themselves as worthy of ruling. With thousands of them concentrated in one place, working toward a common goal, the temptation to seize power would be overwhelming. Perhaps a coalition of the most powerful Sith warriors decides that Palpatine is unnecessary, that they could rule the galaxy themselves. This would lead to a multi-sided galactic civil war unlike anything the galaxy has seen. The Jedi, weakened but still present, fighting to preserve the Republic. Palpatine and his loyalists trying to crush the rebellion within his own ranks. Rogue Sith factions, each led by an ambitious dark side user convinced they should be Emperor. Separatist holdouts taking advantage of the chaos to push their own agendas. The Clone Wars would look like a minor skirmish compared to the devastation this conflict would unleash. Entire star systems would be reduced to rubble as Sith Lords dueled for supremacy, caring nothing for the billions of lives caught in the crossfire. Force storms would tear apart planets. Sith alchemy would create abominations that would haunt the galaxy for generations. This is the dark side at its most apocalyptic, unconstrained by the rule of two. Unleashed in numbers that the galaxy hasn't seen since the ancient Sith Empire fell millennia ago. And through all of this chaos, we have to consider Anakin Skywalker. In the canonical timeline, Anakin's fall to the dark side was gradual, the result of years of manipulation, fear for Padme, and the bonds he formed with Palpatine. But in this alternate timeline, everything is different. Anakin would be aware of the Sith army from the beginning. He would fight against them, sense their corruption, see firsthand the horrors they inflict. Would Palpatine still be able to turn him? It's possible that Anakin's fall would be accelerated. If Palpatine reveals himself earlier, if he frames his Sith army as a necessary evil to bring order to the galaxy, if he still exploits Anakin's fear of losing Padme, then perhaps the Chosen One still becomes Darth Vader. But the nature of that transformation would be different. Vader wouldn't be the calculated enforcer we know. He would be rawer, more conflicted, possibly more powerful, but also more unstable. His relationship with Palpatine would be different too. Instead of being the sole apprentice, the heir to the Sith legacy, he would be one dark side user among thousands, forced to prove his worth constantly. Alternatively, Anakin might never fall at all. Seeing the Sith army's atrocities up close, seeing what the dark side truly represents when unleashed without restraint, might horrify him enough to resist Palpatine's manipulation. He might become the Jedi's greatest warrior against the Sith, using his unparalleled power to turn the tide. In this scenario, the prophecy of the Chosen One might be fulfilled much differently, with Anakin destroying the Sith not by killing Palpatine at the end of his life, but by leading the Jedi in a campaign to eradicate the Sith army before it can destroy the galaxy. Let's also consider the practical problems Sidious would face in maintaining his Sith army. Training is one thing, but logistics are another entirely. An army needs supplies, transportation, communication, organization. The clone army had a well-established infrastructure, built and maintained by the Kaminoans with Republic funding. But a secret Sith army? How do you supply thousands of Force users without anyone noticing? How do you transport them across the galaxy? How do you keep them fed, armed, and equipped? The financial burden alone would be staggering. Palpatine is wealthy, and he has access to Separatist and Republic resources through his various personas, but outfitting an entire army of Sith would drain even his considerable resources. Lightsabers don't grow on trees. Each one requires a Kyber crystal, and those crystals are not easy to obtain in large quantities. The Jedi control most of the known Kyber crystal sources. Palpatine would need to either raid those sources, risking early detection, or find alternative methods of arming his warriors, which might make them less effective. Then there's the question of leadership. The clone army had a clear chain of command, with Jedi generals at the top and clone commanders executing their orders with precision. But Sith don't follow orders well. They respect strength and fear consequences, but they don't have the ingrained obedience that the clones possessed. Palpatine would need to establish a hierarchy within his Sith army, appointing generals and commanders from among the most powerful and loyal dark side users. But each of those appointments creates a potential rival, someone who might decide they deserve the throne more than Palpatine does. To maintain control, Palpatine would need to be actively involved in a way he wasn't with the clone army. He couldn't delegate and trust that his orders would be followed. He would need to use fear, intimidation, and probably frequent executions to keep his army in line. This would consume time and energy that he spent on political maneuvering in the canonical timeline. He would be less effective as Supreme Chancellor because he would be too busy managing his volatile army. And what about the other Force-sensitive beings in the galaxy? The Night Sisters of Dathomir, the Guardians of the Wills, various Force traditions scattered across unknown space. In the canonical timeline, most of these groups were minor players, marginalized or ignored by the Jedi and Sith alike. But a galaxy-wide Sith recruitment and training program would affect them directly. Palpatine's agents would be kidnapping Force-sensitive children from every world they could find. These other traditions would resist, would fight back, would potentially ally with the Jedi against this new Sith threat. The conflict would become even more complex, with multiple Force-using factions involved. Consider also the impact on the Separatist movement. In the original timeline, Count Dooku led the Separatists, providing a Force-sensitive figurehead for their cause. But if Palpatine is openly commanding a Sith army on behalf of the Republic, what happens to Dooku? Does he remain undercover, pretending to lead the Separatists while secretly coordinating with Palpatine? That becomes much harder when Republic Sith warriors are killing Separatist forces. Does Dooku openly declare for the Republic, abandoning the Separatist cause? That would collapse the movement prematurely, before Palpatine is ready to consolidate power. More likely, Dooku would find himself in an untenable position. He might break with Palpatine entirely, becoming a genuine Separatist leader rather than a puppet. Or Palpatine might decide Dooku is no longer useful and have him killed early, which would deprive the Separatists of their most competent leader and might cause the war to end before Palpatine can use it to seize emergency powers. Either way, the carefully balanced conflict that Palpatine orchestrated in the canonical timeline becomes much harder to maintain. The war itself would be shorter, but far more brutal. Without millions of clones, the Republic's ability to fight a prolonged conflict is limited. Palpatine would need to push for a quick victory, using his Sith warriors as shock troops to deliver decisive blows to Separatist strongholds. But every battle would be a bloodbath. The galaxy would be traumatized in ways that would take generations to heal. Planets that experienced Sith occupation would be left with scars both physical and psychological. The hatred and fear generated by this conflict would make the subsequent Empire's rule even more precarious. And let's not forget the Jedi's own response in terms of training and preparation. If they're fighting Sith warriors openly, the Jedi Order would be forced to adapt. Their combat training would intensify. Their teachings about the dark side would become more practical, less theoretical. Young Jedi would be rushed through training and sent to the front lines out of necessity. The Order would become more militaristic, more focused on power and combat effectiveness, which would push them closer to the dark side themselves. This creates a tragic irony. In fighting the Sith, the Jedi might become more like their enemies, losing the very principles they're fighting to defend. Some Jedi might fall to the dark side during this conflict. The stress of constant combat against dark side users, the temptation to use dark side techniques to gain an edge, the trauma of seeing fellow Jedi slaughtered, all of these would create conditions where Jedi could fall more easily than in the canonical timeline. Palpatine might even be able to recruit fallen Jedi into his army, which would be a propaganda victory as well as a practical one. Every Jedi who falls proves his point about the weakness of the light side, about the superiority of the dark. But perhaps the most significant difference would be in how the galaxy remembers this conflict. The Clone Wars, despite their brutality, faded into history relatively quickly. The Empire suppressed information about them, rewrote history, and most citizens were willing to forget the trauma in favor of the peace and order the Empire initially provided. But a war fought with Sith armies? That would be impossible to erase. The atrocities would be too numerous, too visible, too horrifying to simply forget or rewrite. Future generations would remember this as the Sith War, a second coming of the ancient conflicts that nearly destroyed galactic civilization. It would be a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when the dark side is allowed to run rampant. This would actually make Palpatine's job harder if he does manage to establish an empire. Instead of being seen as the savior who brought peace, He would be seen as the monster who unleashed the Sith. His regime would lack legitimacy even by authoritarian standards. He would rule through fear alone, with no pretense of benevolence or popular support. The long-term consequences for the galaxy would be profound. In the canonical timeline, the Sith were defeated at Endor, and the galaxy eventually moved toward recovery and rebuilding. But in this alternate timeline, with thousands of Sith warriors scattered across the galaxy, some of whom surely would have survived whatever final conflict ended Palpatine's reign, the Sith threat would persist for decades or even centuries. Splinter factions, rogue dark side users, and Sith cults would plague the galaxy long after Palpatine's death. The Jedi Order, if it managed to survive at all, would be engaged in an endless war of extermination against these remnants. And then there's the question of Force balance. The prophecy of the Chosen One spoke of bringing balance to the Force, and in the canonical timeline, this was interpreted as Anakin destroying the Sith and ending their corrupting influence. But what does balance mean when there are thousands of Sith? The dark side would be so prevalent, so powerful, that the cosmic force itself might respond in unexpected ways. Perhaps the Force would create multiple Chosen Ones, or empower the Jedi beyond their normal capabilities, or manifest in entirely new ways to counteract the darkness. The galaxy might see Force phenomena that haven't occurred in millennia, all because the balance has been so drastically disrupted. We should also consider what this means for galactic culture and philosophy. The presence of a Sith army would force every citizen to confront the reality of the dark side in a way that most never had to in the canonical timeline. The Force would no longer be a mysterious power wielded by the distant Jedi Order. It would be a tangible, terrifying force that could destroy your world, corrupt your leaders, and turn children into monsters. This might lead to a galaxy-wide backlash against all Force users, Jedi included. Movements might arise calling for the restriction or even extermination of Force sensitives, regardless of their alignment. The Jedi would find themselves fighting not just Sith, but also fearful citizens who see them as part of the problem rather than the solution. Alternatively, some might be seduced by the power the Sith display. Darkside cults might proliferate, with non-Force sensitive citizens attempting to learn Sith teachings in hopes of gaining power themselves. This would create a new criminal element. Wannabe Sith who lack true power but who are willing to commit atrocities in pursuit of dark side mastery. The galaxy would see a rise in occult violence, ritualistic murders, and other horrors as people try to emulate the Sith they've seen in battle. The technology of the galaxy might also develop differently. In the canonical timeline, the Clone Wars drove innovation in military technology, leading to better ships, weapons, and armor. But a war against Sith warriors would drive innovation in anti-Force user technology. We might see the development of weapons specifically designed to counter Force abilities, armor that protects against lightsabers and Force lightning, devices that disrupt a Force user's connection to their power. Some of this technology existed in various forms throughout Star Wars history, but it would become mainstream, mass-produced, and highly sophisticated in response to the Sith threat. This arms race between Force users and technology would have fascinating implications. As anti-Force weapons become more effective, the advantage that Sith warriors have over conventional soldiers diminishes. This might lead to a reversal where, by the later stages of the war, Sith warriors are actually less effective than well-equipped conventional forces. Palpatine's decision to create a Sith army, which might have seemed brilliant initially, would prove to be a strategic blunder as the galaxy adapts to counter his forces. Now, let's address the fundamental question. Why did Palpatine choose clones in the canonical timeline, and why was that the right choice? The answer reveals the depth of his strategic genius. Palpatine understood that power is not just about raw strength. It's about perception, about maintaining the right appearance while concealing your true nature. The clone army allowed him to do exactly that. He could wage war, accumulate emergency powers, and position himself as dictator, all while maintaining the illusion of serving the Republic's interests. The clones were perfect because they were neutral tools. They had no agenda beyond serving the Republic, no dark side taint that would alert the Jedi, no ambitions that would threaten Palpatine's control. They were predictable, reliable, and when the time came for Order 66, a Sith army could never provide that same level of subtlety and control. Every Sith warrior is a potential problem, a variable that could derail the plan. They're detectable through the Force, they're prone to infighting, they're ambitious and treacherous by nature. Using them openly would expose Palpatine's true nature far too early, before he had secured the political power necessary to survive that revelation. The clone army was a scalpel. A Sith army would be a hammer. And while hammers have their uses, you can't perform surgery with one. Palpatine's plan worked because it exploited the Jedi's weaknesses perfectly. The Jedi trusted in the Force, believed that they would sense the presence of the Sith, and assumed that the dark side's influence would be obvious and detectable. They were right about all of that. What they failed to account for was that Palpatine had no need to corrupt the clone army with the dark side. He had technology, biology, and behavioral conditioning on his side. The inhibitor chips were a mechanical solution to what the Jedi thought of as a mystical problem. And that's why they never anticipated Order 66. A Sith army eliminates all of that advantage. It's a direct confrontation between light and dark, exactly the kind of conflict that the Jedi are trained to fight. They might not win, but they would at least recognize what they're facing and respond accordingly. Palpatine's greatest strength was his patience, his willingness to work in the shadows for decades until everything was perfectly positioned. Creating a Sith army would require him to reveal his hand far too early, to fight a direct war against the Jedi before he had neutralized their political power and influence. It's a path that leads to either a quick defeat or a Pyrrhic victory that leaves him ruling over ashes. So what is the final verdict on this alternate timeline? In almost every conceivable scenario, Palpatine's decision to create a Sith army instead of using clones would backfire spectacularly. It would expose him too early, create uncontrollable variables, and unite his enemies against him in ways that his canonical plan never did. The galaxy would be plunged into a darker, more brutal conflict, but Palpatine himself would be far less likely to achieve his ultimate goal of becoming Emperor. And even if he did manage to seize power, the empire he created would be unstable, constantly threatened by internal and external enemies, unable to maintain the iron grip that the canonical empire achieved. The brilliance of Darth Sidious was not in his raw power, though he was certainly one of the most powerful Sith Lords who ever lived. His brilliance was in his understanding that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your enemy never sees. The clone army was that weapon. It was subtle, it was patient, and it was perfectly designed to destroy the Jedi Order from within. A Sith army, for all its fearsome power, could never have achieved what Order 66 accomplished in a single day: the near-total extermination of the Jedi with minimal warning and maximum efficiency. This alternate timeline serves as a reminder of an important truth about power and strategy. Raw strength is not always the answer. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from overwhelming force, but from careful planning, from understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves, from striking at the moment when they are most vulnerable and least expecting it. Palpatine's original plan embodied all of these principles. His hypothetical Sith army would have violated every one of them. The Clone Wars, as horrific as they were, served Palpatine's purposes perfectly. They weakened the Republic, exhausted the Jedi, and allowed him to consolidate power while appearing to be the galaxy's savior. A Sith war would have achieved none of that. It would have been a spectacle of dark side power, impressive to witness, but ultimately counterproductive to Palpatine's goals. The galaxy would have seen him as a threat from the beginning, and united against him accordingly. The Jedi, instead of being scattered and betrayed, would have fought as a cohesive order with the full support of the Republic behind them. The war might have been won by sheer numbers and ruthless application of dark side power, but the cost would have been incalculable, and the prize, the galaxy itself, would have been too broken to rule effectively. In the end, this thought experiment highlights why Palpatine was the most successful Sith Lord in history. Not because he was the strongest in the Force, though he was formidable. Not because he had the most powerful army, though his empire's military was vast. But because he understood that true power comes from working in the shadows, from manipulating systems and people, from winning before the battle even begins. The clone army was the perfect expression of that philosophy. A Sith army would have been a rejection of it, a return to the old Sith ways that had failed again and again throughout history. And that is why, in nearly every conceivable version of this alternate timeline, Palpatine would have failed to achieve his vision of eternal Sith rule over the galaxy. But let's dive even deeper into the specific mechanisms of failure that would plague Sidious's Sith army. Consider the educational infrastructure required for such an undertaking. The Sith had spent a millennium operating under the rule of two, which meant that all Sith knowledge was concentrated in exactly two individuals at any given time. The master taught the apprentice everything, withholding nothing except perhaps the final secrets that would allow the apprentice to overthrow them. This system ensured quality control. Every generation of Sith was as powerful or more powerful than the last, because each apprentice had to be strong enough to kill their master. Now imagine trying to scale that system up to thousands of students. Sidious would need instructors, multiple layers of them, to train his army. But who would these instructors be? He couldn't clone Force-sensitive instructors because Force sensitivity doesn't work that way. It's not purely genetic in a way that could be reliably replicated. He would need to create a teaching cadre from among his Sith warriors. But this immediately creates a problem. The most powerful warriors would be the best teachers, but they would also be the greatest threats to his rule. Every instructor he empowers becomes a potential rival who has their own cadre of loyal students. The academic structure would need to be carefully designed to prevent any single instructor from accumulating too much power or loyalty from their students. Perhaps Sidious would rotate instructors frequently, ensuring that no bond forms between teacher and student. Perhaps he would institute a culture of betrayal where students are encouraged to kill their instructors once they've learned everything they can. But both of these approaches create massive inefficiencies. The first produces poorly trained warriors who never benefit from long-term mentorship. The second wastes his most experienced instructors and creates a culture so toxic that cooperation becomes nearly impossible. Let's also examine the psychological profile of a Sith warrior trained in this system. In the traditional master-apprentice relationship, the apprentice has years to study their master, to understand their weaknesses, to plot the perfect moment for betrayal. There's a perverse intimacy to it, a depth of connection, even if that connection is ultimately predatory. But in Sidious's mass training system, students would be just numbers, interchangeable parts in a machine designed to produce dark side wielders as quickly as possible. These warriors would lack the focused hatred that makes traditional Sith so dangerous. Their rage would be diffuse, unfocused, turned inward as much as outward. They would hate their instructors, hate their fellow students, hate the system that broke them, and hate Sidious himself. But that hatred wouldn't be channeled into ambition or purpose. It would just be generalized destructive impulses. These warriors would be dangerous, certainly, but they would also be unstable in ways that make them unreliable as military assets. Imagine a Sith warrior who's been trained in 6 months through torture and Sith alchemy versus a Jedi Padawan who's been trained for years in discipline, meditation, and moral philosophy. In a straight fight, the Sith warrior might win through sheer aggression and willingness to use lethal force. But in terms of mental stability, strategic thinking, and ability to function as part of a larger organization, the Jedi would be vastly superior. The Sith warrior would be more like a rabid animal than a soldier, effective in the short term but ultimately self-destructive. Now let's talk about the specific military engagements and how they would play out differently. Take the Battle of Geonosis, the opening conflict of the Clone Wars. In the canonical timeline, the Republic arrives with a newly revealed clone army, and the Separatists are caught off guard by the sheer numbers and coordination of the clone forces. It's a Republic victory, though costly. But imagine if instead of clones, the Republic deployed several thousand Sith warriors. The initial shock would be even greater. Sith warriors dropping into the Geonosis arena, lightsabers igniting, cutting through battle droids like they're made of paper. Count Dooku would be stunned. He knows Sidious's plan, or at least he thinks he does, but an open deployment of Sith warriors? This wasn't part of what he was told. The Jedi in the arena, already surrounded and outnumbered, would sense the overwhelming darkness descending on them. Some might freeze, unable to process what they're sensing. Others would immediately recognize the existential threat and begin fighting with desperate intensity. The battle would be shorter but far more brutal. Sith warriors don't take prisoners. They don't show mercy. Every battle droid they encounter would be destroyed, but so would every Geonosian civilian in the vicinity. The forges and factories of Geonosis would be turned into slaughterhouses. By the time the battle ended, the Republic might have won, but Geonosis itself would be a smoking ruin, its population decimated, its industrial capacity destroyed. This sets the tone for the entire war, or consider the Battle of Christophsis, where Anakin and Obi-Wan defended the planet against a separatist blockade. In the canonical timeline, it was a relatively straightforward military engagement with clear objectives and rules of engagement. But with Sith warriors involved, the battle transforms into something nightmarish. Sith warriors wouldn't be content to simply break the blockade. They would descend to the planet's surface and begin systematically terrorizing the population to demonstrate Republic power. Imagine Sith warriors going door to door in Christophsis' cities, dragging out anyone suspected of separatist sympathy and executing them in the streets. Imagine them using the Force to extract information through torture, leaving broken minds and bodies in their wake. The Jedi generals would be horrified and would try to stop them. But what authority do they have over an army they didn't create and don't control? Conflict between Jedi and Sith warriors would be inevitable, possibly even leading to battles within the Republic's own forces. This internal conflict would cripple the Republic's war effort. Every engagement would be complicated by the need to manage tensions between Jedi and Sith forces. Commanders would need to carefully separate the two groups to prevent friendly fire incidents, but this defeats the purpose of having both force-using contingents. The Republic's forces would be divided against themselves before they even engaged the enemy, which is exactly the kind of weakness that competent separatist commanders could exploit. Let's examine a specific scenario in detail: the Siege of Mandalore. In the canonical timeline, this was a joint operation between Republic clone forces and Mandalorian warriors led by Bo-Katan to remove Maul from power. It was a success, with Ahsoka Tano capturing Maul and restoring some semblance of order to Mandalore. But with Sith warriors instead of clones, the entire operation becomes impossible. First, why would Bo-Katan accept Sith warriors on Mandalore? The Mandalorians have a complicated history with the Force, but they're warriors who respect honor and combat prowess. Sith warriors represent everything that Mandalorians despise: cruelty without purpose, power without discipline, strength used to terrorize rather than to protect. Bo-Katan would refuse the Republic's help entirely, rather than allow Sith warriors to set foot on Mandalorian soil. Even if the operation somehow went forward, the Sith warriors would be fighting Maul, who is himself a Sith-trained dark-side user. There would be a strange kinship there, a recognition between dark-side users that would complicate loyalties. Some of Sidious's Sith warriors might decide that Maul is more worthy of their loyalty than Sidious, especially if Maul offers them positions of power in his Mandalorian criminal empire. The operation could result in defections, turning what should be a straightforward military action into a complex political nightmare. And what about battles in space? The clone army included not just ground troops, but also pilots, naval officers, and support personnel. Sith warriors might be effective in ground combat, but how do they function as pilots? The dark side enhances reflexes and aggression, which could make for effective starfighter pilots in some ways. But it also encourages recklessness and individual glory-seeking, which are terrible traits for formation flying and coordinated naval tactics. Imagine a squadron of Sith pilots in V-19 Torrent starfighters engaging separatist forces. Instead of maintaining formation and following their squadron leader's orders, each pilot would be trying to rack up the most kills to prove their superiority over their squadron mates. They would break formation to chase targets, leave their wingmen vulnerable, and generally behave in ways that would get themselves and their allies killed. The Republic Navy would need to keep Sith pilots in isolated roles where their lack of discipline wouldn't endanger entire operations, which severely limits their utility. Capital ship operations would be even worse. Running a Star Destroyer or Venator-class Star Destroyer requires hundreds of crew members working in precise coordination. You need communications officers, gunnery crews, engineers, navigators, and dozens of other specializations all functioning as a seamless whole. Sith warriors, trained only in violence and domination, would be useless in most of these roles. They could serve as boarding parties or security forces, but they couldn't operate the ship itself. This means the Republic would still need a conventional military, which brings us back to the fundamental problem. If you need regular soldiers and officers anyway, what's the point of the Sith army? They're expensive to train, difficult to control, and only useful in a narrow range of combat situations. You could achieve better results by having a conventional military augmented by a small number of dark side special forces units, but that's not what we're discussing. We're talking about replacing the clone army with a Sith army, and it simply doesn't work at a practical level. Let's explore the economic implications more thoroughly. The clone army was expensive, certainly, The Republic took on enormous debt to pay for it, debt that was part of what destabilized the government and made Palpatine's power grab possible. But at least the clones provided clear value for money. Each clone was a trained soldier ready for deployment, capable of following orders and working as part of a unit. The cost per clone was high, but the return on investment was clear. But a Sith warrior? The resources required to find a Force-sensitive child, transport them to a secret training facility, put them through years of brutal conditioning and training, equip them with a lightsaber and armor, and then maintain them as part of a military force would be astronomical. You're looking at costs per warrior that would be 10 or even 100 times higher than the cost of a clone trooper. And for what? A warrior who's more powerful individually but less reliable, less controllable, and useful in fewer situations. The galaxy's economy would be devastated by the attempt to fund this Sith army. Even with Palpatine's access to both Republic and Separatist resources, the costs would be unsustainable. He would need to divert funds from other crucial programs, which would create political opposition even from his allies. Senators would demand to know why so much money is being spent on this mysterious Force user program when their constituents need infrastructure, healthcare, and economic development. The political cover that Palpatine relied on would evaporate as the fiscal reality of his Sith army became apparent, and we haven't even discussed the costs of failure. When a clone trooper dies, it's tragic but replaceable. The Kaminoans can grow another clone. But when a Sith warrior dies, you've lost years of training, enormous financial investment, and a rare Force-sensitive individual who can't be replaced easily. Each death would represent a catastrophic loss of resources, which means Sidious would need to be much more conservative about how he deploys his forces. But conservative deployment of a smaller force means fewer victories, which undermines the entire strategic purpose of having the army in the first place. Let's consider the propaganda war, which was crucial to Palpatine's success in the canonical timeline. He used the Clone Wars to paint himself as a strong leader protecting the Republic from chaos and violence. He controlled the narrative, ensuring that Republic citizens saw him as their savior. But how do you spin a Sith army as a positive thing? The Sith are the ultimate villains in galactic history. Children grow up hearing stories about how the Sith nearly destroyed civilization thousands of years ago. The word itself is synonymous with evil in most galactic cultures. Palpatine would need to somehow convince Republic citizens that these Sith warriors are actually good, or at least necessary. Maybe he rebrands them, calls them something else, creates a mythology around them as misunderstood Force users who are willing to use darker methods for the greater good. But that's a tough sell, especially when these warriors are committing atrocities on every battlefield they enter. The holonet would be filled with footage of Sith warriors torturing prisoners, executing civilians, and reveling in destruction. No amount of propaganda can overcome that kind of visual evidence. Opposition to the war would crystallize much faster than it did in the canonical timeline. Senator Padme Amidala and others who opposed militarization would have much clearer evidence that the Republic has lost its way. They wouldn't just be arguing against the war in abstract terms. They could point to specific horrors committed by Sidious's Sith army and ask how this is different from what the Sith of old did. The peace movement would be larger, more vocal, and more politically powerful, which would constrain Palpatine's ability to maneuver. Some Republic systems might even secede to the Separatists out of fear of what the Republic has become. Imagine you're a senator from a peaceful core world, and you learn that the Republic is deploying Sith warriors. Your first thought would be, have we become the very thing we're fighting against? Systems that had stayed loyal despite Separatist propaganda might reconsider their allegiance. The Republic itself might fragment, creating a three-way conflict between the Republic, the Separatists, and independent systems that reject both sides. This fragmentation would be disastrous for Palpatine's plans. His entire strategy relied on maintaining control of the Republic, using its democratic institutions as a facade while accumulating dictatorial powers behind the scenes. But if the Republic starts falling apart because of his Sith army, he loses the very tool he's been using to seize power. He might end up ruling over a much smaller empire than he achieved in the canonical timeline, or he might not be able to establish an empire at all, instead presiding over a republic that shrunk to just a handful of core systems, while the rest of the galaxy descends into chaos. Let's talk about specific Jedi responses and tactics that would emerge in this alternate timeline. The Jedi Order, faced with an army of Sith, would need to completely rethink their approach to combat and training. They would establish specialized anti-Sith task forces, Jedi teams trained specifically to counter dark side users. These teams would study ancient Sith techniques, develop counter tactics, and train in ways that the modern Jedi Order had abandoned centuries ago. Masters like Mace Windu, who already practiced Vapad, a lightsaber form that channels the opponent's dark side energy, would become crucial teachers. His combat philosophy, which walks the line between light and dark, would be exactly what the Jedi need to fight Sith warriors effectively. We might see the resurrection of other ancient Jedi techniques, forms of combat and force abilities that had been deemed too dangerous or too close to the dark side for normal Jedi to study. Desperate times call for desperate measures. The Jedi might also develop technology specifically designed to counter Force users. They could work with Republic scientists to create devices that disrupt Force connections, armor that resists lightsaber strikes, or weapons that can't be deflected with the Force. Some of this technology existed in limited forms throughout galactic history, but it would become a major focus of research and development. The Jedi Order, which traditionally eschewed dependence on technology, would find itself forced to embrace it as a necessary tool for survival. Training of younglings would accelerate dramatically. The Jedi can't afford to spend decades training each Padawan when they're facing an army of Sith. They would implement compressed training programs, taking younglings from the creche to the battlefield in a fraction of the time it normally takes. This would produce less well-rounded Jedi, warriors who know how to fight, but who haven't fully internalized the philosophy and discipline that makes a true Jedi. These young Jedi would be more vulnerable to the dark side themselves, more likely to fall in the heat of battle, which creates a vicious cycle where the Jedi Order's own desperation corrupts it from within. Some Jedi might advocate for extreme measures. Perhaps a faction emerges that argues for using dark side techniques against the Sith, fighting fire with fire. They would say that the traditional Jedi way isn't working, that the Order needs to be willing to do whatever it takes to win. This would create a schism within the Order, with some Jedi adhering to traditional teachings while others embrace a more pragmatic, ruthless approach. The Order could literally split in two, with hardliners on both sides refusing to work with those they see as either too soft or too corrupted. This internal conflict within the Jedi Order would be yet another victory for Palpatine, even as his overall plan falls apart. He's always wanted to destroy the Jedi, and watching them tear themselves apart over how to fight his Sith army would be deeply satisfying to him. But it wouldn't be enough to save his plan. A fractured Jedi Order is still an order that knows he's the enemy, that's actively working to oppose him, and that has the support of at least part of the Republic behind it. Now let's examine the role of key individual characters in this alternate timeline. What happens to Obi-Wan Kenobi when he's fighting alongside Sith warriors instead of clone troopers? Obi-Wan is the ultimate Jedi diplomat, someone who believes in negotiation, in finding peaceful solutions, in the inherent goodness of people. Fighting a war with Sith as allies would be psychologically devastating for him. Every battle would force him to watch atrocities he's powerless to prevent, to compromise his values just by his presence legitimizing the Sith army's actions. He might resign his commission as a general, refusing to fight under these conditions. Or he might stay, believing that his presence is the only thing preventing even worse atrocities, that without Jedi oversight the Sith warriors would be completely unrestrained. Either choice would haunt him. If he leaves, he abandons soldiers and civilians to the mercy of Sith warriors. If he stays, he becomes complicit in their crimes. It's a moral trap with no good answer, and it would break him in ways that the canonical Clone Wars never did. Yoda would face a similar crisis. As Grand Master of the Jedi Order, he would bear ultimate responsibility for the Order's decision to fight alongside Sith warriors, assuming the Jedi even make that choice. More likely, Yoda would refuse from the beginning, leading the Order in open opposition to the Republic government's use of Sith forces. This would put the Jedi Order at odds with the Republic itself, potentially leading to a complete break between the two institutions for the first time in 1,000 years. If the Jedi Order breaks with the Republic, where do they go? They can't stay on Coruscant. The Jedi Temple would become a target. They would need to evacuate to find a new base of operations from which to continue their opposition to the Sith. Maybe they retreat to one of their ancient temples on worlds like Ossus or Tython. Maybe they scatter, with individual Jedi operating as independent agents throughout the galaxy. Either way, the unified Jedi Order as a galactic institution would effectively cease to exist, replaced by a resistance movement or a government in exile. Ahsoka Tano's story would be completely different in this timeline. In the canonical timeline, she left the Jedi Order after being falsely accused of a crime, disillusioned with the Order's willingness to sacrifice her to preserve their political standing. But in this alternate timeline, her reasons for leaving might be even more fundamental. She might see the Jedi's inability to effectively oppose the Sith army as a failure of everything the Order claims to stand for. Or she might leave because she sees the Order beginning to use dark side techniques themselves and refuses to compromise her principles. As an independent operator, Ahsoka could become a symbol of resistance to both the Sith army and the corrupt Republic government that created it. She would be hunted by both sides, too dangerous to ignore but too skilled to easily capture. Her journey would take her to the underworld of the galaxy, working with smugglers, criminals, and other outcasts to fight the Sith in ways that the Jedi Order can't or won't. She becomes a legend, the Jedi who stood alone against the darkness when everyone else either fell or fled. What about Qui-Gon Jinn? In the canonical timeline, he's dead long before the Clone Wars begin, but his philosophy of following the will of the living force rather than the dictates of the Jedi Council becomes more relevant than ever in this alternate scenario. Had he lived to see the Sith army, he would have been one of the first Jedi to recognize that the Council was leading the Order astray. He would advocate for a return to fundamental Jedi principles, for rejecting political entanglements entirely, for focusing on individual acts of compassion rather than grand military strategy. His conflict with the Council would be legendary. Mace Windu and other traditionalists would argue that the Jedi must engage with reality as it is, not as they wish it to be. Qui-Gon would counter that engaging with the Sith on their terms means the Jedi have already lost. The debate would define the Order's response to the crisis, with different factions following different philosophies. Some Jedi would follow Qui-Gon's example, becoming wandering peacekeepers who avoid the war entirely. Others would follow the Council's direction, fighting the Sith with every tool at their disposal. Let's consider how the Force itself might respond to this situation. The Force seeks balance, and an army of thousands of Sith warriors represents a massive imbalance toward the dark side. The Force might manifest that need for balance in unexpected ways. Perhaps we would see a corresponding increase in light side Force phenomena. Jedi might find themselves able to perform feats they never could before, channeling the Force with a power and clarity that hasn't been seen in generations. The living Force might guide more individuals to discover their Force sensitivity, creating a spontaneous surge in light side Force users to counterbalance the dark. Alternatively, the Force might respond through catastrophic events designed to cull the Sith population. Natural disasters, plagues, cosmic phenomena that specifically target locations where dark side energy is concentrated. This would seem like divine intervention to those who witnessed it, the Force itself rising up to destroy those who have. The Sith themselves would have divided interpretations of these events. Some would see it as proof that they need to be stronger, to push further into the dark side to overcome the Force's resistance. Others might experience doubt, wondering if they've gone too far, if they're violating some fundamental cosmic law that will ultimately destroy them. These doubts would be weakness in Sith philosophy, and those who experience them would either need to overcome them or be destroyed by their rivals. We should also examine how the wider galaxy's Force traditions would respond. The Night Sisters of Dathomir practice their own form of dark side magic, distinct from Sith techniques. They would see Palpatine's Sith army as both a threat and an opportunity. Perhaps they attempt to ally with the Sith, offering their own warriors and unique magical abilities. Or perhaps they see the Sith as rivals who must be destroyed before they consume all dark side knowledge and power for themselves. The Guardians of the Wills on Jedha, who revere the Force but aren't Jedi, would likely become refugees. Their temple, their city, their entire way of life would be threatened by the conflict between Jedi and Sith. They might take their sacred texts and artifacts and flee into the unknown regions, preserving their traditions until the galaxy returns to sanity. Or they might take a more active role, using their unique perspective on the Force to broker peace or to develop techniques that neither Jedi nor Sith had considered. In the unknown regions themselves, the Chiss Ascendancy and other civilizations would watch the core world's descent into chaos with concern. The Chiss, who have Force-sensitive navigators of their own, would understand the implications of a Sith army better than most. They might close their borders entirely, refusing to let the conflict spread to their territory. Or they might see it as an opportunity to expand their influence, offering refuge to Jedi or Republic citizens fleeing the war in exchange for technology and knowledge. The criminal underworld would have complex reactions. Organizations like the Hutt Cartel, Black Sun, and the Pike Syndicate thrive in chaos. But there's chaos, and then there's catastrophe. A galaxy consumed by Sith warfare would be bad for business. Trade routes would become too dangerous, markets would collapse, and the careful balance of power that criminal organizations rely on would be shattered. Some crime lords might even find themselves working with the Jedi or the Republic, recognizing that they need some form of stable government to survive, even if that government is flawed. Let's discuss the aftermath scenarios in more detail. If the Jedi somehow managed to defeat Palpatine and destroy most of his Sith army, what kind of galaxy are they left with? The Republic would be shattered, possibly beyond repair. Trillions of beings would have died in the conflict. Entire sectors would be devastated, their economies destroyed, their populations traumatized. The Jedi Order itself would be a shadow of its former self, having lost many members and having compromised many of its principles in the fight against the Sith. Reconstruction would take generations. The Jedi would need to rebuild trust with a galaxy that's seen Force users, both light and dark, commit horrors in the name of their ideologies. New governments would need to be established, new social contracts negotiated. There would be calls to regulate or even ban Force users from holding positions of power, to prevent another Force-using dictator from ever rising again. The Jedi might find themselves living in a galaxy that fears them almost as much as it feared the Sith. Survivors from the Sith army would become a persistent problem. Even if 99% of them are killed or captured, that still leaves potentially hundreds of Sith warriors scattered across the galaxy. These remnants would become warlords, crime bosses, or cult leaders, using their dark side powers to carve out petty kingdoms in the chaos of the post-war galaxy. Hunting them down would consume the Jedi Order's resources for decades, possibly centuries. It would become the defining mission of the Order, turning Jedi from peacekeepers into witch hunters. Some of these surviving Sith might genuinely try to reform. Having seen the destruction that the dark side caused, having lived through the horror of the war, they might seek redemption. They would approach the Jedi, asking for guidance in returning to the light. The Jedi would face difficult choices. Do they accept these former enemies and try to heal them, or do they view them as irredeemable threats that must be eliminated? Different Jedi would make different choices, further fragmenting the Order. The role of the Chosen One prophecy would be completely transformed in this timeline. In the canonical timeline, Anakin was prophesied to bring balance to the Force, which he eventually did by destroying the Sith. But in a timeline where thousands of Sith exist, how does one individual bring balance? Perhaps the prophecy was never about one person, but about one person's choice or action that catalyzes a larger change. Maybe Anakin's role is to unite the fractured factions opposing the Sith, to be the symbol around which resistance coalesces, or perhaps the prophecy fails entirely in this timeline. Maybe the Force's attempt to bring balance through the Chosen One simply cannot overcome the massive dark side imbalance that Palpatine has created. The prophecy becomes a tragic example of how even cosmic forces can be thwarted by sufficient evil and will. The Jedi would have to grapple with the possibility that they placed too much faith in destiny, that free will and choice matter more than prophecy ever did. The technology of the galaxy would be forever changed by this conflict. Weapons designed to kill Force users would proliferate. Every major military would want them. Every security force would train with them. Every bodyguard protecting important officials would carry them. The galaxy would become a more dangerous place for Force users of all kinds, not just Sith. Jedi would need to be more cautious, more protective of their identities, more aware that simply being a Force user makes them a target. Anti-Force technology might even lead to the development of devices that can suppress Force connections entirely. Imagine collars or restraints that cut a Force user off from their power completely. These would be used in prisons, but also potentially by governments that want to control Force-sensitive populations. It's a dark road that leads toward oppression of Force users as a class, regardless of whether they're light or dark. The Jedi would find themselves fighting not just for their lives, but for their right to exist at all. Medical science would advance in certain areas, particularly in treating the psychological trauma of surviving Sith torture or attack. New therapeutic techniques would be developed, new understandings of how the Force can be used to heal minds broken by dark side exposure. But this knowledge would come at a terrible price, learned through the suffering of millions of victims. The galaxy's understanding of psychology, of trauma, of evil itself, would be permanently altered by the experiences of the Sith War. Art and culture would be deeply impacted. This war would inspire works of tragedy, horror, and despair unlike anything the galaxy has produced before. Future generations would create operas, holovids, and novels attempting to process the trauma of living through a Sith army's reign of terror. Some of these works would be cathartic, helping people heal. Others would be exploitative, using real suffering for entertainment value. The cultural memory of this war would shape galactic civilization for thousands of years. Religious and philosophical movements would emerge in response to the war. Some would argue that the Force itself is evil, that it corrupts everyone who touches it regardless of intention. They would advocate for a galaxy where Force users are identified at birth and prevented from ever training in Force abilities. Others would embrace dark side philosophy, twisted by the war into believing that only through strength and domination can order be maintained. Still others would seek a middle path, arguing that both Jedi and Sith were wrong, and that a new understanding of the Force is needed. The Jedi Order, if it survives, would never be the same. They would be humbler, more aware of their limitations, less confident in their understanding of the Force. They might abandon their grand temple and return to being wandering peacekeepers, the way they operated in the ancient days before they became entangled with galactic politics. Or they might become more militaristic, recognizing that sometimes force is necessary to oppose evil, that their traditional pacifism failed when it mattered most. Training methods would certainly change. The Jedi would place more emphasis on recognizing and resisting dark side temptation. Every Padawan would be taught about the Sith War in graphic detail, shown exactly what the dark side leads to when embraced fully. The Order might even create a formal practice of studying captured Sith teachings, not to use them, but to understand how the enemy thinks. This would be controversial, with some Jedi arguing it's too dangerous while others insist it's necessary. The relationship between the Jedi and whatever government emerges from the chaos would be strained at best. No politician would want Jedi in positions of authority after seeing what Force users are capable of when they control armies. The Jedi themselves would be wary of entanglement with government, having learned that their involvement in politics and warfare nearly destroyed their order. A mutual understanding might emerge. The Jedi operate independently, intervening only in crises, while the government maintains distance. Individual worlds would develop their own responses to Force users. Some might welcome Jedi as protectors and refuse to allow any Force user with dark side tendencies on their planet. Others might ban all Force users entirely, seeing them as too dangerous to tolerate. Still others might try to control Force users through registration systems or mandatory training programs overseen by civilian authorities. The galaxy would become a patchwork of different policies, making it difficult for Force users to know where they're safe and where they're at risk. The economic systems of the galaxy would take decades to recover. The war would have disrupted trade routes, destroyed industrial capacity, and consumed resources on an unprecedented scale. New economic powers would rise from the ashes, filling the vacuum left by the collapse of established corporations and trade federations. These new entities might be more ethical, having learned from the failures of the past, or they might be even more ruthless, having thrived during the chaos of the war. The banking clan, the trade federation, and other major economic powers from the canonical timeline would be in ruins if they backed the wrong side in this conflict. Imagine the Trade Federation being held accountable for supporting the Republic's Sith army, their assets seized, their leaders executed or imprisoned. The financial structure of the galaxy would need to be completely rebuilt from scratch, with new institutions that hopefully have learned not to enable genocide and oppression for profit. Lastly, let's consider Palpatine's own fate in more detail. If he survives the initial exposure and manages to maintain some form of power, he would be trapped in a nightmare of his own creation. He wanted an empire where he rules unchallenged, where his will is law, where he can explore the dark side without limit. Instead, he gets a fractured galaxy where his authority is constantly questioned. where his Sith warriors are as likely to betray him as serve him, where every day is a struggle just to maintain control. He might try to consolidate power by purging his own ranks, killing any Sith warrior who shows signs of ambition or disloyalty. But every purge weakens his army, gives his enemies opportunities to strike, and increases fear and resentment among the survivors. He could end up trapped in his throne room, surrounded by bodyguards he doesn't trust, ruling over an empire that exists more in his imagination than in reality, slowly going mad from the paranoia and isolation that his own choices created. Or perhaps he realizes his mistake and tries to correct course, attempting to transition away from the Sith army toward a more conventional military. But by then it's too late. The damage is done, his enemies are mobilized, and his Sith warriors won't simply accept being disbanded. They have tasted power and won't give it up willingly. Palpatine would find himself fighting a war on multiple fronts, against the Jedi, against the Republic's loyalist factions, against separatist holdouts, and against his own Sith army. No matter how powerful he is in the Force, he cannot win a conflict like that. The Force works in mysterious ways, and balance must ultimately be maintained. In the canonical timeline, that balance came through Anakin Skywalker's eventual redemption and the destruction of the Sith. In this alternate timeline, balance might have come much sooner. Through the combined resistance of Jedi, Republic forces, and a galaxy united against an obvious and terrifying evil. The lesson is clear. Darkness is most dangerous when it hides behind a mask of light. The moment it reveals itself fully, the galaxy's immune system activates, and even the mightiest Sith Lord can be brought down by the collective will of those who choose to stand against him. Palpatine knew this. That's why he chose clones, and that's why he nearly succeeded in destroying everything the Jedi had built over 1,000 generations.